Hello. Today is the 22nd of September 2025. I think I have something special for you today. I think I do. I was in one of these. I usually go, I have told you many times about it. I go to these um, secondhand bookstores in and around Oxford. And I came across this book. Memory, Hold the Door. The autobiography of John Buchan. And I thought, John Buchan. No, I don't. I've never read John Buchan. The name rang a bell. Yeah, I think what? Yes, yes. The author of, we all know him, The 39 Steps. He was one of the, in 1935 or something like that. I have this lovely little book. Look, it has been in print forever. 3 films were made of this little book. It was, I believe, the one of those first spy thrillers. It influenced uh, Graham Greene and Ian Fleming, the spy thriller. And I have this beautiful little book. I read it. I don't remember much about it, but I remember it was about the spy. And look, it has the golden thing there and this lovely thing. Beautiful. Okay. So I said, oh, yes, John Buchan. What do I know about him? Nothing. And this is his autobiography. I opened it and I said, yes, I'm getting this book because it sounds really fantastic. His memoirs. So I'm going to share this with you. Get it if you can. It's worth whatever money. I got it for in these bookstores. I got it for £3. Can you imagine that? Oh my goodness. I'm so privileged. Anyway, so the thing about his autobiography is that he was born in 1875 and died in 1940. This book was published in 1941. This is one edition from 1941. And in 1941, he went through many, many editions, like 8 or 9. He was very popular. I'll tell you a little bit about his biography, but first about the book itself. He tells us about that pre-First World War world. He was from Scotland, loved the country, loved the hills. All right. And went to Oxford to study classics. He went to Brasenose College. And he tells us about that world and how that world changed after the war. It was changing already. He went to South Africa after Oxford. And he was working there with the British administration and in the Boer War. So he experienced that change in the world pre-World War and after, and then the time in between, and then the beginning of the Second World War. As I said, he died in 1940. The book was published in 41, so he obviously wrote it in 39, 40. So he didn't know what was going to happen, but he knew that here we were with another war. And the questions, the world is changing once again. Where are we going? And I think it's important to read him because you would say that perhaps, my goodness, when the world is changing so rapidly, the despair, when we don't know what is going to happen, everything is in chaos, everything is changing so rapidly. And yet he ends with a song of encouragement. And I'm going to share that with you because I think we are going through the same thing that he was going through at that moment. But in his biography, what is beautiful about it is that although he's telling us about, I did this and then that, he introduces us to all the characters that he met, important people he met, because after Oxford he became a barrister, then he went to South Africa, then he was in the intelligence service, then he was in Parliament for 8 years. He did everything. He ended up as the Governor General in Canada. That is where he died. Very much respected, but he introduced us to all these characters. And what happens is that through the characters and the people, his friends that he's talking about, we see personality types. Personality types. Ramsay MacDonald, for example. Let me, okay, so let me, without further ado, let me first tell you how he starts the book. Okay, in the preface, he says, "This book is a journal of certain experiences, not written in the experiencing moment, but rebuilt out of memory. As we age, the mystery of time more and more dominates the mind. We live less in the present, which no longer has the solidity that it had in youth. Less in the future, for the future every day narrows its span. The abiding things lie in the past, and the mind busies itself with what Henry James has called the irresistible reconstruction to the old too baffled vision of irrevocable presences and aspects, the conscious, shining, mocking void, sad somehow with excess of serenity. Such a search is not a mere catalogue of memories. I have no new theory of time to propound, but I would declare my belief that it preserves and quickens rather than destroys. An experience, especially in youth, is quickly overlaid by others and is not at the moment fully comprehended. But it is overlaid, not lost. Time hurries it from us, but also keeps it in store, and it can later be recaptured and amplified by memory, so that at leisure we can interpret its meaning and enjoy its savor. These chapters are so brazenly egotistic that my first intention was to have them privately printed. But I reflected that a diary of a pilgrimage, a record of the effect upon the one mind of the mutations of life, might interest others who travel a like road. It is not a book of reminiscences in the ordinary sense, for my purpose has been to record only a few selected experiences. The lover of gossip will find nothing to please him, for I have written at length only of the dead. Nor is it an autobiography, for I cannot believe that the external incidents of my life are important enough to be worth chronicling in detail. And it is only in a meager sense a confession of faith. It is a record of the impressions made upon me by the outer world, rather than a weaving of such impressions into a personal religion and philosophy. Someday I may attempt the latter. All right. So he's going when he gets to Oxford as a young man, age 20, he starts telling us about how difficult it was from the hills of Scotland to get to this new place. It was the first time that he visited England. It's very funny. He's going to tell us about some of those experiences. At first, he didn't fit in. And one particular incident, for example, especially I remember one person who asked me to dinner at high table in my first year. For 3 courses, he spoke not a word. This is a Don, a professor, right? And there he was, a young man, trying to make conversation. For 3 courses, he spoke not a word, while I plied him with nervous questions about the weather and the boat race and whatnot. Then the professor, he turned on me his formidable face. "Young man," he said, "I would remind you of what Dr. Johnson said, that the art of conversation does not consist in unmeaning interrogatories." I was stricken with helpless laughter, in which he presently joined, and the ice was broken. About Oxford, my years at Oxford were, I think, one of those boundary periods, the meaning of which is missed at the time, but is plain in the retrospect. The place was still monastic, but the clamor of the outer world was at its gates, and it was on the verge of losing many of its idioms. Very ancient customs were still remembered. For example, it was only a few years before I went up that brazen-nosed men had to go out of college in pairs, a relic of the medieval town and gown troubles. Town and gown troubles, yeah, the students and the ordinary people. Sartorially, my time was beyond doubt a turning point. On Sundays, a dark suit was still obligatory. On weekdays, Brasenose inclined towards tailcoats of tweed and hunting waistcoats, and the headgear was a cap or a bowler hat. But before I went down, the fashion had arrived from Winchester of flannel bags and any kind of jacket at all seasons, and the modern hatless era was dawning. It was the same with our speech, which had early Victorian, if not Regency, traces. We still called the cigar a weed and used the word blood to denote whatever was dashing and high-colored in raiment or behavior. When I visited my brother a year after I went down, when I finished university, I found that this fashion had almost disappeared. In my time, there was no urgent political or religious questions to divide people into militant fraternities. We sought not allies in a cause, but friendships for their own sake. Our creed was Mr. Belloc's. From quiet homes and first beginning out to the undiscovered ends, there is nothing worth the wear of winning but laughter and the love of friends. In that circle of students, there was no pose, unless it be a pose in youth to have no pose. The grand manner in the 18th century sense was still cultivated, which meant a deliberate lowering of key in professions and a scrupulous avoidance of parade. And he tells us a little bit about the people he met there. For example, one of them was Raymond Asquith, the son of the Prime Minister. Just a paragraph. He says, "Of two friends I must write more fully. The first is Raymond Asquith. There are some men whose brilliance in boyhood and early manhood dazzles their contemporaries and becomes a legend. It is not that they are precocious, for precocity rarely charms, but that for every sphere of life they have the proper complement of gifts and finish each stage so that it remains behind them like a satisfying work of art. Sometimes the curtain drops suddenly, the daylight goes out of the picture, and the promise of youth dulls into a dreary middle age of success, or it may be of failure and cynicism. But for the chosen few, like Raymond, there is no disillusionment." Talks a great deal about him. He had come up from Winchester with a great reputation and almost, I think, a little tired. His scholarship was almost too ripe for his years, and he had already conquered so many worlds that he was little troubled with ordinary ambition. As the son of an eminent statesman, he had seen much of distinguished people who to most of us were only awful names, so that he seemed all his time at Oxford to have one foot in the greater world. Not that he gave this impression by anything that he did or said. It was rather by his wholehearted delight in Oxford and his lack of reverence for the standards that ruled it outside it. He had the air of having seen enough of the outer world to judge it with detachment. As a speaker, I never heard him in the political clubs, but in the Union, in the Oxford Union, he was easily the most finished debater of our time. It was a heyday of Union oratory, for Elijah Belloc, F.E. Smith, and John Simon were our immediate predecessors and still took part in debates. He did not seem to seek to convince. Smoothly, almost disdainfully, in his beautiful voice flowed his fastidious satire. There were no signs of careful preparation, and yet, had his speeches been printed verbatim, each sentence would have stood out as finely cut as in an essay of Stevenson's. His politics were hereditary, not, I think, the result of any personal enthusiasm. He had a thoroughly conservative temperament and loathed the worn counters of party warfare. Not greatly respecting many people, he had a profound respect for his father and much resembled him, both in his style of speaking and in the quality of his mind. Okay. One little more nugget here. His humor was oftenest the one from Aristophanes. I remember one instance. Someone in one of the round games, which were then popular, propounded a stupid riddle. The riddle was this: what is that which God never sees, kings rarely see, and we see every day? What is it that God never sees, kings rarely see, and we see every day? The answer was supposed to be an equal. Raymond's answer was a joke. Right. Um, Politics. Then he changed. This friend. He changed obviously with the war. Politics were a different matter. Before the war, he was adopted as Liberal candidate for Derby and made a profound impression by his platform speeches. He had every advantage in the business: voice, language, manner, orderly thought, perfect nerve for a politician. The very fact that he sat loose to party creeds would have strengthened his hands at a time when creeds were in transition. For though he might scoff at dogma, he had a great reverence for the problems behind them. And to these problems he brought a fresh mind and a sincere goodwill. His colleague at Derby, Mr. J. H. Thomas, believed, I know, most heartily in his future, and he won golden opinions among the Labour men with whom he came into contact. It was natural, for he was the spending type in life. He was the spending type in life, the true aristocrat who prefers to give rather than to take, and makes no fetish of a narrow prudence. Democracy and aristocracy can coexist because oligarchy is their common enemy. I am very certain, too, that in Parliament he would have won instant fame. He was to die in the war. His manner of speaking was as perfectly fitted for the House of Commons as that of his father. I can imagine in some hour of high controversy Raymond's pale grace kindling like fire. But the war, the war did not produce a new Raymond. It only brought the real man to light. Okay, so Raymond was to die in the war as so many others. Very wonderful little nuggets all over the place. He says, for example, the life of reason, Santayana has written, is our heritage. The life of reason is our heritage and exists only through tradition. Our heritage exists only through tradition. Now, the misfortune of revolutionists, said Santayana, is that they are disinherited, and their folly is that they wish to be disinherited even more than they are. Little nuggets like this all over the place. So, we're going to encounter all kinds of people. Uh, as we saw, Lord Milner, the Roman statesman, we can see the archetype almost. Lord Milner reminded Buchan not of any modern politician, but of an ancient Roman. His mind was like stone, precise, disciplined, stripped of illusions, cold to some, forbidden to many. Yet to those who knew him well, there was a sense, and he shows us this, there was a sense of integrity and unshakable duty. He embodied the austere administrator, carrying empire like a burden carved with granite, he says. Of Kiplin, the writer. And then there was the artist, the man who spoke not with policies or wit, but with the voice of prophecy. That is how he saw him. To Buchan, Kipling was never a casual conversationalist. Every word seemed to carry weight, and if he were reading signs, as if he were reading signs of the age. After losing his son in the war, this prophetic tone deepened. He seemed less like a novelist, more, he says, like a Hebrew prophet, his art born from grief and sharpened into vision. All types of characters here. But then, where am I? Ramsay MacDonald. I'm going to read quite a bit from, because I was going to say we all remember, we don't. But Ramsay MacDonald, the Labour Party, the statesman, and then the Prime Minister, who was misunderstood, he claims, very often. And this is what he says. I'm going to sort of read, I think it's 1.5 pages. I knew Ramsay MacDonald long before I entered Parliament. Indeed, before I took that step, I had some talk with him as to what room there was for anybody like myself in public life. I was in the House when he led the opposition during the Labour government of 1929-1931, and from the day when he became Prime Minister of a national government, also to the day he retired. In the last 2 years of his premiership, I saw much of him, for during the session, we walked together round St. James's Park on several mornings in the week, and I frequently breakfasted with him and did my best to help a very tired man to arrange his difficult days. He will be a hard personality for historians to judge, since the evidence to a writer 100 years hence will seem a mass of contradictions. He was the chief maker of the Labour Party, and according to his critics, he did his best to destroy it. Before he took office, he preached an emotional kind of socialism, but in his later years, he tended towards a creed scarcely distinguishable from left-centre conservatism. In 1914, at the outbreak of war, he was in opposition to the bulk of his party and to the vast majority of the British people, but no man was less of a pacifist. There were moments when he was a Jacobin and a sans-culotte, and moments when his affections were with the ancien regime. Most of his life was spent with the very plain folk, but his taste was fastidious, his courtesy of an old-fashioned elaboration. And to quote from some novel whose title I have forgotten, he had the so-called aristocratic appearance which is common in England among the middle classes, but unknown among the old nobility. You all know what that means. I think that some of these contradictions can be explained. He had the starkest kind of courage, and if he were challenged or coerced, he was apt to be forced into an opposition which did not represent his real views. That is certainly true of his behavior in the war. Again, his critics said that though his business was to succor the underdog, that he disliked the breed. That was the charge. That is not true. His sympathies were always with the underdog, and he disliked it only when it became smug and patronizing and talked bad economics. Yet I think that here laid his great limitation. In one of his letters, Rupert Brooke wrote that he, Ramsay MacDonald, could Watch a dirty, middle-aged tradesman in a railway carriage for hours and love every dirty, greasy, sulky wrinkle in his weak chin and every button on his spotted, unclean waistcoat. End of quote from Rupert Brooke. Ramsay MacDonald lacked this Catholic in the sense of universal. Ramsay MacDonald lacked this Catholic enjoying zest for human nature, this kindly affection for the commonplace, which may be called benevolence, or better still, loving kindness, the quality of Shakespeare and Walter Scott. He's saying that this was his weakness. It may have been due to some harsh experience in his youth, but he had developed what seemed to me to be an undue fastidiousness. He was too ready to despise. He loved plain folk. He did love plain folk, but they must be his own kind of plain folk, with his own background. Of the ordinary stupid stuff of democracy, he could be as intolerant as Coriolanus. He had all the qualities of a leader: fearlessness, decision, a temperamental mastery, but it was the irony of fate which made him leader of the Labour Party. There he had to deal with honest men, most of whom had drab backgrounds and narrow outlooks, people with whom he could share nothing. Worse, he had to deal with the half-baked, the minor intellectuals. And he knew too the typical socialist intelligentsia, the minor who always end up very much on the right anyway, the revolutionaries, the aristocratic revolutionaries, the minor intellectuals, he calls them, and he knew too well the dismal shallows of their minds. With the really able men of the left, he made no contact. He used to profess an admiration for science and scientists, but his own mind had nothing of the scientific bent. He simply did not understand the language of modern economics. I can only speak of him as I knew him, and that was in his decline. I never heard him in his great days when he was a famous platform orator and a formidable debater. He had still the oratorical habit and would drift into rhetorical cadences, but he had lost his old copiousness and had to drag his thoughts and words from a deep well, so that the result was often a sad anticlimax. His alleged vanity seemed to me to be largely sensitiveness. The struggle of his early years had made him suspicious and too quick to imagine affronts. And he had a queer romantic kink which made him see melodrama in perfectly humdrum affairs. He could not help picturing himself in dramatic parts. To the end, there was an endearing innocence about him. Indeed, if I had to choose one epithet for him, it would be endearing. There was a somber gentleness which fascinated me. In his last years, when mind and body were almost worn out, two things never failed him: courage and courtesy. The whole man was a romance, almost an anachronism. To understand him, one had to understand the Scottish Celt, with his ferocious pride, his love of pageantry and poetry, his sentiment about the past, his odd contradictory loyalties. He would have made an excellent Highland chief 300 years ago, and a heroic Jacobite refugee. That is why he was a successful foreign secretary, for his imagination enabled him to understand large, grandiose things, the conflict of nations, the strife of continents. Now and then, the curtain would be drawn back and something would be revealed of a lonely, inward-looking soul. I remember that when the national government was formed in 1931, the Scots in London gave him a dinner, and in his speech he let his recollection wander back to his boyhood and told of his happiness, absolute happiness, when a harvest worker had been kind to him long, long ago. I shall not soon forget the wistfulness with which he revived that old, dim memory. The man was principally a poet who, like Cecil Rhodes, had not the gift of song. When his days of struggle were over and he found himself in a high place, Prime Minister, he did not quite know what to do with his power. For he was a kingdom of dreams, not of things and men. The silliest charge levelled against him was snobbishness. He liked cultivated, long-descended people and beautiful things, and had the honesty to admit it. But the true definition of a snob is one who craves for what separates men, rather than for what unites them. And of that type, Ramsay MacDonald was the extreme opposite of a snob. He had no real wish to be any kind of grandee. The things which were dearest to him were the things which are happily found in the widest commonality, old friends, the folk of his native parish, the songs and tales of his youth, the seasonal beauties of nature. He had tramped over all my border hills in Scotland and knew every shepherd by name. And once, when he was the most talked of man in Europe, he suggested that he and I should go off for a week's walk in there. I want some pleasure, he said. I want some pleasure before the lean years begin. So you can see this is an example, yes, of how he treats his friends. But the main thing, well, not the main thing, excuse me. What I do want to share with you, and I hope you stay with me, is the very last chapter when he is looking at what is happening in the world. Is there any hope for the world? Has it ever been worse than this? He had seen that change before the war, after the war, as I said, now again. Despair? No. And I'm going to read you that chapter. He calls it The Other Side of the Hill. Sir Walter Scott had a pleasant phrase for middle life. He called it reaching the other side of the hill. It is a stage which no doubt has its drawbacks. The wind is not so good. The limbs are not so tireless as in the ascent. The stride is shortened. And since we are descending, we must be careful in placing the feet. The feet. But On the upward road, the view was blocked by the slopes, and there was no far prospect to be had except by looking backwards. Now the course is mercifully adapted to failing legs. We can rest and reflect since the summit has been passed. And there is a wide country before us, though the horizon is mist and shadow. These chapters have been written several thousand miles from England, in a country, and that is Canada, in a country of new problems and hopes, where the mind has nonetheless been clouded by the secular anxieties of Europe. Half detached and half embroiled, Canada's position seems to be much like my own. I have in my lifetime passed from an era of peace through various unsettled stages into a world which, in Sir Thomas More's phrase, is ruffled and falling into wildness. But I retain enough of the disengagement of the earlier world to refuse to surrender my right to cheerfulness. I was brought up in times when one was not ashamed to be happy, and I have never learned the art of discontent. I preserve my devotion to things afar from the sphere of our sorrow. It seems to me that those who loudly proclaim their disenchantment with life have never been really enchanted by it. Their complaints about the low levels they dwell in ring hollow, for they have not known the uplands. Didn't write it down. A Calvinist who was generous of heart. Yeah. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed it. Get his works. Get this book. Thank you. Bye bye.